We have on our panel today two leading figures in national security, Admiral Michael Brown and Dr. Eric Haseltine. If you are here to gain a better understanding of cyber threats to individuals and organizations, it doesn't get better than this. So let's start with the introductions. During his 31-year career in the United States Navy, retired Rear Admiral Mike held significant cybersecurity leadership positions within the Departments of Defense and Homeland Security. He specializes in executive leadership, including crisis management, in the public and private sectors. Formerly the president of RSA Federal and vice president/general manager of the global public sector for RSA Security, Admiral Mike is now a board advisor at Eclypses. He is also the founder and president of Spinnaker Security. Dr. Eric Haseltine is an author, futurist, and neuroscientist who has held several senior executive positions in private industry and the public sector. He was the Associate Director and CTO for National Intelligence at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of Research at the National Security Agency, an Executive Vice President at Walt Disney Imagineering, and Director of Engineering at Hughes Aircraft Company. For the past few years, Eric has been developing completely new forms of digital media, entertainment, and advertising, in addition to cutting-edge cyber and industrial security solutions. He describes himself as having retired at least twice. So we have a lot to cover today, so I'll jump straight in. Eric, this year has seen several high-profile cyber attacks on critical infrastructure in the United States. What lessons can we learn from the Colonial Pipeline and JBS incidents?
Well, I think the number one lesson is that there is no such thing as 100% security. These infrastructure outfits had good security, good people working for them, but they were up against the equivalent of nation state actors who really, if we're going to be honest, if they want you, they got you. Information systems are so complex, there is no way you can be 100% secure. And that's a really important insight from what happened, because it should completely change the philosophical point of view on cybersecurity from trying to keep everything out to assuming that you have been penetrated and proceeding accordingly.
Thank you. And Admiral Mike, both JBS and Colonial Pipeline paid millions of dollars in ransoms to their cyber attackers. Are you in favor of paying ransoms to cyber criminals?
I'm not, and I'm not because it just doesn't change the equation at all. It just motivates the bad guys, and in some cases, for the good guys, the victims of these cyber attacks, what it ends up doing is providing what they might think as a reserve that if they can. They don't have to pay as much attention to their cybersecurity and hygiene from a technology standpoint because they can always pay. But the result is, number one, you don't know if you're going to get the keys after you've paid. Number two, there is still enormous amount of reputational harm that can occur, either through the fact that it is known that you were breached and paid a ransom, as well as all the information that may have been stolen and that is therefore available in the environment. So it's not a true, I think, best strategy to execute by paying the ransom. I think that there's things that can be done that are either tied to best practices or other capabilities to reduce the risk and therefore perhaps save a little bit of Bitcoin on your side.
So prevention rather than payment. Eric, technology is constantly evolving and new cybersecurity threats emerge every day. Should we operate with the mindset that we are always under attack? I think you sort of touched on this with your first answer.
Yes, and there are many dimensions of that will feel alien to a lot of cybersecurity people in industry. The most important principle is that it's not about technology. It's about mind games between defenders and attackers. For example, you win if you can convince your attacker to go attack someone else. And how do you do that? Well, you can raise the perceived price they pay for attacking you. For example, what happens if when they get inside your network and they get your data, there's a little gift in there that melts their computer? What if you have canary tokens that can trace them? What if you put a lot of false information in there so that if they go ahead and use it, there will be bad consequences for them? These are some kind of offensive, defensive techniques that I think are required. And the lawyers at a lot of companies don't like these ideas, but you know what? This is the world we live in. And as a biologist, I look at nature and how creatures like the octopus, if anyone who's seen My Octopus Teacher, they have to live 24/7 next to predators that would eat them in a nanosecond, like sharks. And yet, more or less, they survive. And when you look at their techniques, they do some of the things I'm talking about. You know, they advertise it like the poisonous octopus. There's a big price to pay if you attack me. Go eat something else.
So we should be taking inspiration from Indiana Jones and booby trapping our systems?
Well, I think that's part of it. And again, it is a paradigm shift in how you think about it. You know, people think about, you know, data loss prevention systems, behavioral and signature-based detection systems, firewall technology, things like that. And you have to do all of that stuff. It's kind of the price of admission. But that's not really where the game is won or lost. Where the game is won or lost is up here. And it starts with understanding that the biggest problem is human. You know, Rob Joyce is now the head of cybersecurity at NSA. And he has said publicly that when NSA succeeds, it's not their technology, it's they exploit human weakness. And, you know, having been at NSA, I will tell you that's absolutely true. And so on the other side, you're a defender, you say, well, where are we weak? And it starts in unusual places. It starts, for example, with the CEO telling the chief information officer, do more with less and take all these legacy systems and plug them together and make them, you know, continue to work because we can't afford to, you know, do it right the first time. And so that's an organizational behavior problem that no one ever looks at as a cybersecurity problem, but believe me, it is. And, you know, really smart, cunning adversaries look for information about someone about to change from one system to another, because whenever there's such a change, there's a huge vulnerability. And so that's kind of my message, is focus on the human dimension and focus on the mind games between the defenders and the attackers. And I think people would do a whole lot better.
I just want to jump in because I do agree with you, Eric. And I think, you know, part of what we're talking about, Sarah, is having a whole suite of tools or a whole suite of weapons that are available. And some of the things that Eric mentioned about are what I would call active defense capabilities that do exactly what we're trying to do. Make it costly, make it more expensive, either in time or resources, for the bad guys to attack you. And the more capabilities that you have out there in play, you know, it will affect their ability to focus. Again, as he mentioned, using the brain to try to achieve what they're trying to achieve.
So putting into practice things such as false floor techniques that the Russians have used.
That's right. So what happens is an attacker gets in, and they almost always try to do what's called privilege elevation, so that they become what's called a super user or root user with, you know, kind of synoptic privileges over everything. And there are some nation states that do what's called a false floor. When someone gets in, they think they're super user. They think they have all these privileges to change what happens to files and so forth. And it turns out they don't. And those are some techniques that we can learn by studying at the knee of the master. And I would say the Russians are right up there at the top if they're not at the very top. I studied their cybersecurity methods for 4 years when I was a contractor at a 3-letter agency studying Russian cyber. And I have tremendous admiration for them and how they approach these problems.
Thinking a bit about cybersecurity leadership from the top, Admiral Mike, President Biden issued an executive order requiring the federal government to advance towards zero trust architecture. And then he also issued a memorandum on improving cybersecurity for critical infrastructure control systems, in which he called on the critical infrastructure community to voluntarily meet security standards like data encryption and two-factor authentication. What do you think are the implications of these strategic movements to the private sector and individuals? And do you think perhaps stronger legislative action is needed to protect critical infrastructure?
So we've just got an hour, right?
Unfortunately, yeah.
So significant implications, I believe. And again, it's a continuation of the journey that we've been on, both in the public and the private sector here in the US and around the world for the last couple of decades. Recognizing the fact, going back to some of the things that Eric mentioned in the first question, with technology encompassing everything we do, we've got to take a new approach. And that's part of the reason for zero trust architecture. It's a recognition that there is no edge because everything is the edge. And in order to reduce the risks associated with this use of technology, zero trust architecture, the standards in the practices that we're talking about, having the right level of authentication, authorization in something that I'm used to in the Defense Department, not only a security clearance, but the need to know, is a dramatically different approach. On the latest executive order that you mentioned, which is about the private sector, it really is trying to help create the rights, again, using Defense Department terms, battle rhythm between the government, who has an obligation to protect the United States, therefore the citizens and the infrastructure, as well as it's also got a regulatory response. But that's only going to work if the private sector has visibility and sort of really understands what are the expectations, the best practices and the standards and so on. That's really, I think, the intent behind those two executive orders. On the issue of legislation, there's going to be plenty. The question is, will it be good? Will it be confusing? And regardless, legislation takes a long time. And to look at legislation through the prism of this is going to solve our problem on cybersecurity is just false. It's not the answer. Again, going back to what Eric has said, what I used to say in the White House is the hard stuff is the soft stuff. It's not about the technology. We've got super technology. It's about the people and the processes that the people put in place. And legislation will not legislate away the risks associated with humans on either end of the I was going to say battle, but the environment.
I just want to echo one point about that. It definitely is the wetware, as we say, that's the biggest thing. And my concern about zero trust, with the basic idea of zero trust, for those of you who aren't up to speed on it, is that you don't care really at the lower levels of the stack what the hardware is, or even what the middleware is, or even what the OS is. That can all be virtualized with things like SE Linux and things like that, where you can run on untrusted hardware but still be trusted. Well, I think on its face, there's only so far you can take that principle. And so that's the number one thing. Don't drink the Kool-Aid and assume that that's the answer. It's part of the answer. And then the other answer has to do with really more the anthropology of cybersecurity. To not look at an enterprise as a bunch of nodes and edges, but to look at it as a collection of people, nodes and edges of humans who happen to interface with nodes and edges of a network. And when you look at it that way, as an attacker, you can see all sorts of vulnerabilities, starting with, does the CEO and the board of directors who make the financial decisions really understand what's going on? I'll give you one example. If you asked a CIO of any big enterprise, what is your network? Define every node and every edge of your network. They couldn't do it. They don't know what their network is. I guarantee you, they don't know. You would be shocked at what national security entities don't know what their own networks are. So how can you defend what you don't know? It reminds me when I was doing my PhD research on big pythons that were like 12 feet. I could inject them with antibiotics that they needed by going into their tail, and it took them so long for the nerve impulses to hit the head. I was in and out before they even knew I'd done anything. And that's the problem of defending a system that's really big and distributed. So it is a cultural thing. And I think that CEOs, or the smarter ones, are starting to realize they need to get deeper and more hands-on in the details of what's really going on in the bowels of their organization.
And to build off of that again is when you think about today's environment, and again, I know we'll discuss a little bit about election security, but today's environment, going back to the application of technology, mobile is extremely important, and it's in everybody's daily routine. And so having mobile security as part of the strategy is really critically important. We've got to be able to battle the vulnerabilities, whether they're inside the TLS protocols or otherwise. It really is important to recognize, as we both have stated, that there is no edge, and therefore we have to prioritize and understand the uses of the technology, how it is applied, and ensure that there's the appropriate security wrapped around those elements.
So we're talking about critical infrastructure, and obviously that embraces many different sectors. Should the same cybersecurity approach be applied across the board, or should we be treating the cybersecurity of, say, voting systems differently from that of water supply systems?
Well, I'll just start by saying that they are different, because SCADA, for example, which is the backbone of a lot of infrastructure, was not designed with security in mind. From where the chips are made, where the units are made, the access control and all of that. So one of the first questions you have in dealing with infrastructure is, how do you deal with a legacy system that was absolutely not designed with security in mind and has innumerable vulnerabilities? So I do think they are somewhat different animals. I think with 5G and IoT over time, they're going to become pretty much indistinguishable. But the fact is, for many, many decades to come, we're going to be running really critical things on really old, not security designed infrastructure. And that requires, I think, a different approach.
So I would add, even though the sectors are different and the application of technology in those sectors may differ, that doesn't mean we can't have a holistic strategy to apply. And there are a couple things that I think would go along with that. Number one is, as I've said a couple of times, really understanding the best practices and standards that can be put in place for those technologies. As Eric mentioned, SCADA and some of the old electric grid components were not made with the forethought that they would be part of a digital network. And so, but there are things that can be done within the strategy to reduce the risk again. And so that's where it actually takes into consideration the need for, while you have an overarching strategy, you need the expertise from these sectors to be able to clearly articulate how operations are run, where the crown jewels are within that particular sector or subsector, and apply the standards and best practices. I think that's how we, it would be great if someone would invent a silver bullet or have the 100% solution. As far as I know, we won't be seeing that anytime soon. So how do we reduce the risk and accept risk where it won't have a critical implication to what we're doing, whether it's in government or in the private sector?
I'm in violent agreement with that. Frederick the Great says, "He who defends everything defends nothing." And the philosophy of defend the stuff that you absolutely have to, that world peace depends upon, and take a more risky approach with everything else. Because at least you got to do a good job at one or two things that you absolutely positively can't fail at. And whether you're SCADA or whether you're a high-end, cutting edge IT network, that philosophy, I think, that holistic approach that the Admiral mentioned, I do agree with that.
And I think maybe these days the crown jewels for a lot of people would be the data.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that perhaps is missing in the discussion right now with respect to zero trust architecture. So when thinking about zero trust architecture, there's an enormous amount of work being done to help define the reference architecture in the things that I've mentioned in the past. But the crown jewel, as you've said, is the data, and not all data is the same priority or risk when coming to exposure. So again, knowing where, what, how to protect that data, I think is critically important. Again, thinking about the mobile environment, or as we've been talking about with 5G and OT and so on, data is going to be pervasive. It already is, but it will become more pervasive. And so what are the standards and best practices to protect that data throughout that potential journey that they'll be on?
Yeah, and I want to add to that. When most people think of protecting data, they think of someone stealing it or locking it up for ransomware. And those are very important. But General Clapper, who was a former OD&I, said kind of the new frontier is someone gets in and puts stuff in your data to change your decision making. For example, suppose you're a quant on Wall Street or a hedge fund, and someone's putting data in to bias your algorithms to go do certain things in futures markets. And because I put that data there that know that, I can take advantage of that. Where there's money to be made by doing stuff, you can guarantee people are going to do that. And so not just data protection, but what we call information assurance, data integrity. How do you know your data is good data? I think that is going to become an increasingly important. And you know, that's what happens in the public sphere too, with misinformation that's out there and the so-called internet trolls that are operating out of, you know, St. Petersburg. You know, the integrity of the data is in some ways more important. And one last point on that again, playing head games, you can purposely corrupt your own data. So if someone's going to go use it and do something with it, they're going to suffer.
Yeah. I like that idea.
I like it too. And, you know, talking about data, the reason we went to zero trust was because we could no longer trust everybody was doing what they should be doing. So we went to zero trust. And the idea is by utilizing a zero trust strategy, we'll now be able to trust everything. Sometimes I try to wrap my head around all of that and try to figure out, okay, where are we at the end game? But it gets down to what Eric's talking about, having the ability to trust the data that you're seeing, that you're being told, and what's the best mechanism to be able to do that?
Well, talking about trust and also misinformation, which Eric touched on earlier, when it comes to securing elections, is the biggest challenge actually one of technology, or would you say that perhaps misinformation is a bigger challenge right now?
Well, I think you have to look at the strategic objectives of those trying to mess with the elections. The Russian general staff, who strangely enough publish their findings and their conclusions in academic journals over there, and I read them in Russian, and I'm fascinated by what they're saying. They have in Russia what they call strategic tasks. And I'm not singling out Russia as the only bad guy, quote. It's very interesting to get inside the head of your adversary. And what they say is that if we want to accomplish strategic tasks, like neutering NATO is number one for them, and keeping the near abroad, meaning their former states and former Warsaw Pact, from going too far over to the West, those are existential for them. You see, that's what they're trying to accomplish with their election interference. And they have accomplished it to some degree. And they're not going to stop. And the way they go about it is, you know, you cannot kill an idea with a bullet. There is no defense against a compelling idea that is taken up in a fertile soil. And so they know that. So looking at cybersecurity with a new dimension of information warfare, that it's not just protecting the bits or, you know, securing the bits or attacking someone else's bits. It's, you know, what are the quality of those bits and what are they accomplishing? And so that gets into, if you know that that's their mindset and that they want to do that, you actually operate in a very different way. And, you know, one of the ways that you operate is, again, you elevate the price. Okay, country, nation state X, if that's what you want to do, and you want to put certain things at risk in our country, then guess what? It's going to happen in your country. You know, we had in the nuclear arena this idea of mutually assured destruction and deterrence, and it worked pretty well for many, many decades. We don't have that in cyber. That's still evolving. And I think until we have that, we're going to continue to see the kind of things that we're seeing.
Do you think we will have that?
Yeah, and this is one last point, is that compromising the elections themselves, and like what happened in North Carolina in 2016 and what happened in about 37 other precincts, where there were some very fishy things, you know, not flame, but smoke, that someone was doing something there. Probably didn't influence the outcome of the election, but clearly someone was trying to do something. Much worse than undermining, you know, who actually gets the right votes is undermining the public's confidence in the electoral system, because that is the very foundation of democracy.
Yeah.
And you know, that, I mean, and so that to me is really, if you're interested in election security, that is the most important thing, is what do we do to rebuild the public's confidence in our electoral system?
And I think that is key. Completely agree with that. You know, it became easy for the nation state actors, Russia in particular, to achieve the goal of undermining the integrity of the elections, i.e. trust in the elections, through their use of misinformation. It was not a technical strategy with respect to changing votes or preventing votes from occurring. It was really which really goes back to Soviet doctrine, and Dr. Haseltine can certainly tell us about it, where it is about deception and wetware, as he discusses it. They really got into our brains, and so what we need to do is, and there is a way for us to do this, because the United States, the whole premise of our election system is a local election system, and that affords the opportunity for true application of best practices and standards. It makes it very difficult for nation states from a technical perspective to attack the integrity of the election, and to think about, again, how do we build the trust, make it easy for voters to, one, vote, at the same time doing it securely, with the knowledge that they're doing it securely. And I think that there's a ample opportunity as we ratchet up to 2022 in the constant evolution of elections here in the US to try to attack that problem. We need to address two things: the misinformation and disinformation strategies that are being employed, and not just by nation states, with a secure, easy to use environment for our citizens to vote.
So do you think we need to have simpler explanations of the technology involved? Do you think people need a bit more information about how the whole thing works, so they can feel like they have a bit more faith in it?
I'm going to step in and say no. You know, I've kind of spent my lifetime as a technology CTO explaining technology to bright people who really don't get technology. And I kind of given up. You know, it doesn't work. And to people with an 8th grade education, the general public, it's pretty much hopeless. You know, the nuances of things like zero trust and blind tokens and, you know, public key and all that kind of stuff, it's hopeless. And so I think that I wouldn't focus on the technology. I would, you know, when I was at Walt Disney, there was a saying that went around over and over again when it came to such matters. And he said, you know, you can talk to people's minds or you can talk to their hearts. There are a whole lot more hearts out there. So I believe, and again, it gets also into the realm of information warfare, that if we want to build trust in election security, I think we can't do it by saying, oh, look at this technology and how cool it is and how it works. You know, that might work in some sectors, but for your general public who we're talking about, because general public trust in elections has been really compromised, I don't think that's going to work. So what I would advocate is more speaking to people's hearts. You know, for example, new technology like this can be a lot safer than paper because you know where it is, you know who has it, you have biometrics, you have all kinds of parameters and signatures that can be used to say, yeah, and you can do multi-factor, not just two-factor, multi-factor authentication. You can't do that with paper. So the reality is these things are a whole lot more secure than paper, but you can't make that argument on technology. My suggestion would be speak to the heart and say, you know, there are a lot of soldiers overseas who really can't vote while they're serving their country. There are a lot of handicapped people out there who really, it's just, they could in theory, but in practice, it's too much work. There are a lot of underadvantaged people, people in rural areas. It's very difficult to vote. And so our focus is serving the underserved. And, you know, maybe tell stories of people who now for the first time get to vote because of some new system. I think that's going to be more compelling. You know, in fiction writing school, they teach you, tell the story of a war from the point of view of one soldier in the trench. Because what people care about is people. They don't really care about technology. They don't understand technology, and they sure as hell don't trust technology. They don't trust anything the media says. So I think we've got to take a fundamentally different approach in the way we message.
So I would build off of that. And I think the conversation, we have to actually have two conversations. I definitely believe, as Eric mentioned, that the users of the electoral system needs to be, the conversation needs to be from the heart and to be shaped in that manner. But I think that we also have to have a conversation with the operators of the systems themselves, which can be a little bit more technical in depth, and will also provide them with the ability for them to communicate from the heart to the users. And if we take that combined approach, I'm hoping, optimist to begin with, that we'll get to a more trusting environment with respect to our election process. Again, my mother does not need to know the technical details around why it is safe to vote using her iPhone, but she needs to know it is securely, and she can do it from her kitchen if necessary. But the local election system needs to make sure that they are taking the appropriate security best practices and standards, and can communicate to my mother that it's good to go and you really want to use it.
I do agree with what you said, that I think there, I will modify what I had said earlier. I do think that getting into some of the nuts and bolts with people who operate election systems actually is important. But I'm trying to put myself in their place, and someone comes to me and says, this is safe. Having attacked systems and defended them and being extremely cynical about even the best and the latest and greatest. What would work for me in that position, if someone said it, but as in Hollywood said, show, don't tell.
Yeah.
Don't explain to me how it's safe, show me. And to me, there's really only one. And that's like 24/7 pen testing, gray hat attacks. And show me how it responds to those attacks, and show me when inevitably those attacks succeed, how you detect and respond and adapt to those attacks. Because security is not a single point in time or space. Security is a process. I spent a lot of time going up against the insurgents in Iraq on IEDs, and we would come up with some protection against their new kind of attack, and then they would adapt. And what we learned is this is a never-ending process. It is not a point solution. And so I think when we communicate to operators of elections, we need to, show more than tell, and be honest. When there's a problem, say, yep, there was a problem. We detected it. Here's how we dealt with it. And to me, I would trust someone who's very realistic in that way, more than someone who says, trust us, this thing works. And, that's it.
You mentioned before, Eric, about no one believing what they read in the media. I know that cyber attacks are sometimes very sensationalized, and the deletion of code at a water supply can be reported as an attempted mass poisoning. But how should cyber attacks be reported, and when should the public be informed of an attack?
Well, I don't have an answer to that one. That is that's what we call a wicked problem, in that cyber attacks happen so often, and ransomware happens so often. Probably the ones we hear about, even with critical infrastructure, are a few percent of the ones that are actually happening. But as the reputation problems and other issues associated with it go with it, it's far more pervasive than we know about. And I think that at some point, there's information overload. If we reported all of these things, and people would go, well, it happens all the time, we can't do anything, there will be some learned helplessness. And so I think that the ones that need to be reported the most, I think, are the ones that there are some big so whats. What we learned here in this particular one is really important for other people to get their head around, because this is a completely novel kind of attack. And I'll give you one example of what I'm talking about. I've been writing recently about Havana syndrome, which, for those of you who don't know, is CIA officers and State Department officers have been hearing loud noises and having brain damage and long-term effects. And the National Academy of Science concluded it was pulse microwave radiation. When I was studying Russian cybersecurity back 10 years ago, there was talk in that circles about a viral gun, a radar that you would point at an information appliance and inject malware via a radar. Not Wi-Fi, not Bluetooth, not cellular, a radar, just like in your microwave. And I don't know for a fact, but I suspect that something like that viral gun is what's going on. And one thing you have not heard is, if that's true, how are mobile devices and laptops and things that aren't necessarily connected to a network in the conventional way, how are those being compromised? So if someone were able to say, oh, wait a minute, this is a new kind of attack that we didn't even know about. This is very exotic stuff. Remember I said the Russians are really, really good at this stuff? That would be an example of something that you need to publicize so that people are aware of it. And this is going to happen all the time. There are going to be innovative new attacks that need to be publicized. And I would kind of focus on those.
Admiral Mike, would you agree that cyber attacks should sort of be reported as case studies and learning opportunities?
I do. I agree with what Eric said. And I'll give you a really good example. I do think, before the example, I do think there ought to be, it is a difficult problem. There ought to be some criteria that can be agreed upon that meets the desires of all the individuals or the organizations that need to sort of coalesce around that criteria. It's the regulators, it's government, it's businesses, it's insurance industry, it's citizens. But the example I have is, so I was sent from NSA, DOD to DHS to build out what is now CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and to build the federal civilian government cybersecurity capabilities. After about 8 months, I was up briefing Congress, and obviously everybody's interested in metrics. And part of what I was briefing was, on a regular basis, the number of events that were occurring. And after the second or third time, where the number of events in the federal civilian government had gone from 500,000 in 1 month to 1 million to 10 million over a quarter's time, I was being told that I was failing because the number of events had multiplied by 20. I had to explain that part of the reason the number of events that we were reporting were going up was because we actually have more visibility. All these events were occurring over time, but nobody knew they were occurring. And to Eric's point, what I did was shape them into, here are the top 10 type of activities that we're seeing that can then be put out. These are not just vulnerabilities. These are not just tactics, techniques, and procedures that the bad guys are using, but this is what you need to do to prevent them from being successful. And oh, by the way, they didn't go away. They changed their TTP or whatever. So I do think it's important, and it needs to be in context. And that's one thing that unfortunately, going back to the heart versus the mind, I don't think there is enough of an understanding by all the folks that are involved to have the right context. So getting that criteria is going to be really hard. Going back to Eric and my Massachusetts background, it's wicked hard.
Actually, yeah, thinking, Eric, of what you said earlier about legacy systems and lack of investment, this new infrastructure bill is being discussed and finalized. And I think if it goes through, it would allocate something like $47 billion for resiliency investments to protect critical infrastructure. How would you like to see that money spent?
Well, I think it's staged. There have to be phases. The first phase is to, correct the most egregious vulnerabilities, and there are some. And I think that early on, that's not by replacing things and putting in new monitoring and defense systems. It's using some more of the techniques that I was talking about, like the octopus techniques. It's not, technical smarts, is street smarts. Deception, active measures, things like that. And, maybe make sure that the press gets them out there that, someone got in and did something and then bad things happened to them. I mean, I think that's step one. That stuff is somewhat low-hanging fruit in a way, to kind of put a smoke screen, if you will. In the military, sometimes when they can't defend any other way, they obscure. And so I think borrowing a page from the way the military approaches these things, when you have a very vulnerable force, how do you protect it until you can bring in the bigger guns? And there's things like camouflage, concealment, cover, all of those things. I think that kind of thinking needs to be brought to the party. But then I think that the way I look at it is, it's like you got two tracks. You've got the old rickety steam locomotive track that you have to make as good as possible using the techniques, and it's going to have to continue to operate. We still need power. We still need water. But then you're going to have to build another, high-speed rail track, by analogy, next to it. And you have to have a strategy over time for swapping out, traffic from the old system to the new system in a very controlled, planned way. And then you end up on this newer track that's a lot more safe, a lot more secure, and a lot better. The one thing that I would caution anybody who's taking this 14 billion or whatever it is and moving it is, when you change anything, even for the better, you open up huge vulnerabilities. And I guarantee you, there are evil people like I used to be, who look at this thing, and we actually hunt for cases where changes like these are happening, because we know that there are going to be huge opportunities in the early days of changeover. So just be aware that it's like you've got a patient in the operating room, they're more vulnerable to infection. That's the situation.
So Admiral Mike, if I can ask you to take us into the future, what do you think cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, particularly electoral systems, are going to look like over the next, say, 5 years?
I think it's actually a lot of what we see, unless what Eric just described is put in place. I completely agree with that strategy, which is we cannot secure elements of the electric sector that can't be secured. And so what we can do is try to reduce the risk as much as possible, but build new infrastructure. Build new infrastructure with the understanding that it needs to be agile, that the technology will continue to change, as will the bad actors. The bad actors will continue to morph their techniques and have the strategy to be able to counter that. What I think we're going to see, when I was in government and out, I was always asked, so what kept you up at night? Colonial Pipeline is what kept me up at night, because I knew that was going on. what changed with Colonial Pipeline and with JBS and several other things is we as individual users of critical infrastructure were impacted significantly. And so I think that that's what we're going to see more of. It's not necessarily the technology that from these attackers. It's going to be the implications to the U.S. citizens and businesses and what comes from that. That's what's going to raise in importance and potentially lead to significant changes.
So should we all be keeping generators and bottles of water at home just in case?
I do. It's not just for the winter.
There's one point, though, I'd like to make about that. And it's something that we lose sight of, which is the why. We have nation states going after our critical infrastructure. I think without dealing with the more fundamental problem of why, we're ultimately always going to be behind the 8 ball. Because, changes in technology always favor the aggressor. And this is always going to be true. And so I think that let's take a look at Russia. Do you ever see in the press discussion of why the Russians are doing this? To me, I'm not going to get into the foreign policy part, but I will say that there is a foreign policy part. One thing I learned while working in Iraq on the IED problem is other nation states do communicate with us in strange ways. Like they'll cause us great harm and start more and more letting us know it's them as a way of saying, hey, you want this to stop? I want something from you. And so it's like I said with IEDs, we had some success, but in the end, unless we targeted the why they're doing this, we didn't get very far in the end. And, a lot of times the why in Iraq was money. These guys were making a lot of money making and deploying the IEDs. And when you understand that, you can attack the problem in a fundamentally different way. And so that's the one thing I would leave the audience with is, it sounds like the realm of policy and everything, but, attacks on our infrastructure are a symptom of a disease. They are not the cause of the disease. Yep. And, we have to focus on that. And, one of the things we did in Iraq to reduce the casualties after working on the technology is we go to tribal leaders and we say, hey, are you franchising IED operations that you get paid so that people can blow up and kill Americans? And, they kind of shrug and so you just make it financially worth their while to not do that. And there are some operators over there, I won't mention their names, who got that. And that was why some of the IED casualties went down during the surge. So I think that there is a 100,000-foot view of this thing that we cannot lose sight of. Otherwise, this is just, like I say, a symptom of some much deeper set of issues that are going on. And you cannot divorce the two.
So when we consider what the biggest misunderstanding around cyber threats might be, it could be perhaps not considering the entire context.
That's exactly right. And again, I am not advocating for any policy, but I think a lot about why the Russians are doing what they're doing. And I want to leave you with an image. Let's suppose that Florida and New Mexico decided to secede from the United States. And then Russia came in and still had the Warsaw Pact and recruited them to be part of the Warsaw Pact against America. How would we feel about that? Well, that is exactly what happened to Russia with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the way their former states and the way their Warsaw Pact allies were approached. And a lot of them are now in NATO. And literally some of the former parts of the Soviet Union are kind of in the Western sphere. When the West is Napoleon and Hitler to you, you do not take this lightly. And so really, if you get down to the core of why Russia's doing what they're doing, I just said it. And again, I think that there are some policy issues. And for one thing, at a minimum, if you're not going to address those policy issues, and I'm not smart enough to know what the answers are, that is a wicked problem, okay? You just have to accept that this is going to go on forever. And there's really nothing you can do at a technical level to stop it because you're up against people who are fighting for their very existence.
So Admiral Mike, if we accept that this problem isn't going away, it's going to be around forever, what can America do? Like, how should it try and work with other countries to improve cybersecurity for everyone?
So there's several things, but I think going back to what Eric was just talking about in the biggest, or one of the big misunderstandings, is the fact that too many people ignore the cybersecurity, national security, and business security threats, public safety threats, until it is too late. And that can be the government, or it could be, again, my mother with her car, in not understanding what the implications are. So I think that there are things that we can be doing, it is going to take U.S. partnership. It doesn't have to be U.S. leadership, but it has to be U.S. partnership. And what I'm talking about is like-minded nations still are struggling to come up with what we called in government, what are the norms in cyberspace? What's good, what's bad? And if like-minded nations can come to an agreement, then we can start from the opposite side, which is what Eric was talking about, the why that the other nations are doing whatever they're doing. But until I think we come up with a like-minded approach and a recognition of what is good, and being able to clearly articulate that, again, not just in an interagency perspective or allied perspective, but at the 5th grade level, what is good, what is bad, and let's try to operate in that environment. That way we can send someone into timeout if it's desired. Just talking about my grandkids, where unfortunately I was the first one sent to timeout for not following the orders. But I think that that's what we can be doing as a nation state with like-mindeds.
How do we begin that process? Because you look at various different social media companies that have interviewed groups of people in different countries across the world to try and find a set of standards that they can apply to sort of using Facebook or Twitter, things people can agree on. And I think they struggle to come up with a set of standards. So how do we go about that process?
I think we build on a process that already works. We are many nations and many people, but we are one IP network. I mean, the fact of the matter is geography is dead. We live together in cyberspace much more closely than in geography, and that's just going to continue. So you have things like secure sockets and various other security measures that have been put into internet standards. So I think we have an existence proof for fora and methods to do this. The problem has been, do you get the engagement of the right people at the right time in the right way to make that do all of its potential?
So there are a lot of what I would call government-led activities to try to help to determine what I was just talking about. And if you had talked to me 5 years ago, I would have said that was the government's responsibility. Governments, what they're good at are forcing meetings and compelling organizations to come, not necessarily the outcomes of it. But what private sector can do is actually, in many cases, deliver solutions. What's happened over the last couple of years is the private sector is starting to get together and attempting to foster that set of norms as to what is good and what is bad, and influencing and working with governments in like-minded strategies. So there are government organizations that exist. They do this, whether it's the UN or other organizations. I think what the difference is that there is a much more strategic approach supported by private sector to try to lead to that. And I'm going to be optimistic that we're not going to get to 100%, but I'm optimistic we'll get somewhere on that journey.
I like that optimism. So we're going to take a question from one of the viewers now. They're asking, the United States and Russia have collaborated in space, for example, on the International Space Station for a long time. Why can't we figure out ways to work with them collaboratively here on the ground? Is it just a lack of political willingness to compromise?
So we actually have collaborated, and again, it's not well known. And it's also not fully fleshed out. And so what I'm talking about in my last year or two in government, we were setting up the equivalent of a cyber hotline between Russia and the US. And the idea being, at that stage, we did not want to create an environment where we were going tit for tat, over, up, and escalating out of control in a cyber environment. So that was the original intent. I think part of what we're trying to do is to find out how can we put more operational rigor around that. We've tried it with China, we tried it with Russia, and again, it just hasn't been as successful. And so that's why I talked about the like-minded nations and trying to increase the applicability and potentially for bad actors, which, by the way, we could do something that is perceived outside of the norms, and we would have to either justify it or we'd have to accept the recriminations and potentially other things from the like-minded nations. So I think that's it's not that it's can't be achieved. Again, I'm going to put my optimistic hat on, but quoting one of my presidents, I'm going to trust but verify.
Yeah, and that came from the Cold War nuclear dialogue, and I think where we are with cyber and cooperation is, as with nuclear, there are cooperation about the hotline, and here are some red lines that you should be aware of, and that those conversations are happening. But there are two things about the Russians I think people need to understand. One is, unlike us, they don't differentiate war from not war. The truth is, and this is brutal, there is a hot shooting war going on in cyberspace right now. It's not a Cold War, it is a hot war. And what the public hears about is a small part of it. And every now and then you hear about casualties in that war, but it is going on. So one reason you're not going to get cooperation is we're at war. That's a pretty stark statement, but I actually believe that it's true. The other point is that if you're the Russians, why negotiate with someone who's weak? We don't really have anything to give them. We're very network centric. We're extremely vulnerable. Everything depends on our networks, far more than them. So they're holding all the cards. Why should they negotiate? So my bottom line take home message, if we want to compromise with the Russians and work with them to mutual goals, we have to get our own house in order. So we got some cards to bring to the table, because right now we don't. So get our own house in order first. That's the best way to deal with the Russians.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. It's been an incredibly interesting discussion. I really appreciate you joining us here today. I think the main takeaway for me from this discussion is the human element of cybersecurity. That's what we've been looking at again and again when it comes to motives and weaknesses, cooperation, all of that. It's all about people's hearts. So on that wonderful message, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for having me.
Goodbye.